Welcome to Podcast UFO. I'm Martin Willis, your host. Today is episode number 34 with Terry Hansen. Since the beginning of this podcast, I've had a lot of feedback from people that are looking for something like current news or recent developments, things like that, in the UFO field. So I decided that I'm going to do this and also have links to news articles, etc., in our show notes. So I asked Michael Lauck to come on board. He writes most of our blogs, and I think you'll find this enjoyable. Let's roll right into it.
Dr. Stephen Greer claims to have an alien body. According to BeforeIt'sNews.com and YouTube reports, Dr. Stephen Greer and the Disclosure Project are claiming that a tiny body found in South America is that of an alien. Greer claims that CT scans and X-rays have shown the small body to be some type of organism with the structures of life, lungs, a heart inside. Photographs of the body are included in the BeforeIt'sNews.com article, and a video including the X-ray can be found on YouTube through the link in the show notes.
So Michael, I watched the video on this, and the first thing that comes to mind is why jump that this thing, whatever it is extraterrestrial right off the bat.
I completely agree with that. And honestly, looking at it in the video, it really reminded me of the kind of thing that is in my friend's Sideshow Museum. There were pickled punks, is what they call them, which were weird little bodies in formaldehyde jars or mummified. And that's really, really what it struck me as. For all I know, it could just be a hairless monkey.
In one of the videos I watched anyway on it is that there was no way that it was a monkey, first of all, and that there was nothing about it that had any human properties. The first thing I think of is some type of deformity or some type of animal or something like that. The thing's only 9 inches tall. But whatever happened to, I think it was back in 2007, their farmers in Mexico caught these 2 little 3-inch humanoid-type beings, and I think they drowned one or something like that was still alive. And they were supposed to do a bunch of tests on those things. Did you ever hear about what the results were on that?
No, and I remember hearing that in Coast to Coast in the middle of the night, but never really, it's one of those things that just kind of drifted away.
Now, on Stephen Greer's piece here, he's saying that they have sent off some DNA tests. And I'm wondering, between you and me, why, between you and me and everyone listening, if so, why didn't they wait until the DNA tests were done?
That is a really good question. That is the kind of thing that really casts some suspicion on anything like this. In the non-UFO realm, the recent Bigfoot DNA project that's been going on, since someone broke that story through Facebook, whether or not that was intentional, which is what they're arguing about now, that doesn't carry the weight of, say, Nature or a scientific journal by any stretch of the imagination. And it does seem like it would just damage one's credibility.
Right, absolutely. So let's go on and move on to the next story.
George Fawcett dies. The founder of the North Carolina chapter of MUFON, George Fawcett, has passed away at age 83. In addition to amassing a large collection of what is termed saucerania that is on display at the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, Fawcett wrote a book on UFOs in the Southeast and over 100 articles on the subject. He is also one of the few people to teach a college course on UFOs. You can read more about Fawcett and his career on the homepage of the North Carolina chapter of MUFON. We have a link in the show notes.
Wow. Now, he actually taught a course. Isn't that something? Do you know how long he taught that course?
I'm really not sure. I didn't see that anywhere. I'm guessing it probably wasn't for years and years, and it was only one course. It seems like typically if something sticks around, that you get a 200 level or a 300 level eventually. But just the fact that he taught a course at an accredited university on the subject, I think is a pretty big deal, really.
I think so. Yeah, that's great. All right, and what else do you have for us today?
Next up, we have another Google Street View UFO. In a KPLR TV report that was picked up by the UK's Daily Mail, a pink UFO can be found on a Google Street View image for Dingledine Street in St. Charles County, Missouri, which is just outside of St. Louis. The image was identified as a lens flare by the director of the McDonald Planetarium of the St. Louis Science Center, John Lakey. Although the image is probably a lens flare, to be fair, the director stated that the least likely explanation for a UFO is alien spacecraft because, and I quote, "the distance between stars is just too vast for any kind of realistic travel. Darn. Ha ha." End quote.
Well, I'd like to talk about that quote, but first of all, do you think the pink UFO has a Mary Kay bumper sticker on it?
It very well might be. I mean, it's a bustling community. I live not too far from there, and it's full of housewives and soccer moms. So,
well, listen. Now, first of all, I know that a lot of the Google Street Views do have lens flares that look just like a UFO, but they're definitely lens flares. So that probably is this. But the claim that he makes with the "ha ha" at the end is really the part I'd like to talk about because, first of all, I've said this a number of times on this show, but that's with the thinking that we have in today's science that no one can travel here. How much more advanced beings can be out there, we have no idea. So what's your take on the whole story?
I don't really care how long it takes to get from place to place. Let's say it is impossible and we can only go 10% of the speed of light. It's very hard to go 6 months in scientific popular science, discover kind of magazines without coming across is this the last generation to face death? Are we going to start living 1,000 years? Let's just assume we, start living for a really long time. After the first 10,000 years, you probably get bored enough to say, hey, you know what, I'll take that 5,000-year round trip and see what's out there. I don't think we have to limit ourselves just to, hey, what's the acceleration factor and the and the distances involved? I think that's a really poor argument.
Mm-hmm. You'd have to bring a lot of jigsaw puzzles with you for that. That's
probably.
A long trip. Yeah. All right. What else do you have in news?
Next up is an update on the Amherst UFO. The UPI has an interesting report that the January 8th UFO sighting near Amherst, Massachusetts, may have been a military plane. In fact, its headline clearly suggests it by saying UFO may have been a military plane. The article states that the FAA only found a C-5 cargo plane on radar during the time of the sightings. The end of the article, however, mentions that Lieutenant Colonel James Bishop, the Chief of Public Affairs at nearby Westover Air Reserve Base, said that the C-5 does not match the description of the silent, low-flying triangle or diamond-shaped object that was reported by witnesses. He mentions directly that the C-5 is a very large and noisy craft that is nothing like what was reported. And I found that to be very interesting.
So you're saying, basically, he's saying that it's probably a unidentified flying object?
Well, I don't want to put words in his mouth. He could just be accusing everyone of lying. I don't know. But what is reported in the article, which we have a link to, of course, is that he basically just flat out said the C-5 does not match what was reported.
I like it. All right. So let's see. Let's wrap this up for today.
Okay, I have one more piece. It's not really a news story. It's just something that I ran across recently that I thought was interesting and kind of ties into the official party line from the government on UFOs. And that is a paper called The UFO Hypothesis and Security Questions. This is one of the stranger documents I've run across while researching articles for the website. And it is a National Security Agency document titled The UFO Hypothesis and Security Questions. Dated 1968, it is a short examination of UFOs and the implications for the human race that they present. No author or attribution is given, and it is listed as a draft, but I do trust that it is some kind of declassified NSA document because the PDF has secret crossed out on the top, and because I downloaded that PDF directly from the NSA website. It's actually
amazing.
It's one of 61 documents that you pull up if you search for UFO on the site. So, have you had a chance to read it?
I did, and in a nutshell, why don't you go ahead and say basically what it's saying?
Well, we know it's from late 1968 because one of the footnotes cites a June 1968 document, and it's an interesting paper because near the end, after kind of summarizing the approaches that have been taken so far, it criticizes the leisurely, quote-unquote, scientific approach being taken in regards to UFOs and concludes, quote, It would seem a little more of the survival attitude is called for when dealing with the UFO problem, end quote. And I found that intriguing because this NSA document uses the term UFO problem, and it also, sometime about 12 to 18 months later, Project Blue Book was actually canceled.
That's right.
So was this ignored or coincidence, or was the end of Blue Book the end of the leisurely approach to UFOs?
How about that? So you have a link. We'll have a link to this right in our show notes as well.
It is a link directly to the NSA.gov download, yes.
Wow. Michael, thank you so much for all that great news today, and we're looking forward to having you back on the next show.
Well, thank you for having me on. What's on tap for today, Martin?
Well, next coming up, we have Terry Hansen on propaganda and UFOs coming right up.
Flying saucers are real.
They've seen the aliens buzzing our missile silos.
The UFO phenomenon, either we like it or not, is already very much part of our reality.
That caused a compass needle to spin and spin.
And that's where the whole seed for the idea of underground bases at Dulce was planted.
They had very large eyes, and I found their stare extremely difficult to bear.
I'm on the line with Terry Hansen in British Columbia. How are you doing, Terry?
Good. How are you, Martin?
Good. And we're going to talk about your book, but I'm fascinated in the subject that your book addresses. Can you tell the audience the name of your book?
Yes, it's called The Missing Times, News Media Complicity in the UFO Cover-Up.
Tell us what it is about in a nutshell, if you would.
Sure. Many people have speculated over the years about the way some fairly major UFO stories never seem to make it into the national media. They occur on a local level, and there's a lot of publicity. People are aware of it on the regional or local level, but somehow the big newspapers just don't seem to be interested in the story. So this question has been raised by various UFO researchers as to whether the news media are somehow playing games or playing ball with the government to suppress coverage of the UFO topic. And so that's really what I decided to look into. And I started out by researching the relationship between the news media and the U.S. government going back about 100 years to try to understand whether and to what extent the news media, the big news organizations, have worked with the government to manage public opinion. Now, the most common situation where that occurs is, of course, wartime. We're all familiar with the fact that during wars such as World War I and II, there's quite a bit of censorship and propaganda, but not many people know very much about it and how it worked and all that. So I spent a couple chapters in my book just reviewing the history of censorship and propaganda in the news media historically in sort of the general sense and how it's worked. And I demonstrate, I think, that this idea that the news media try to project that they're independent and sort of adversarial with the government is really a myth. That historically the story is that the media and the government have been working together very closely for many, many decades, certainly since World War I, and the relationship has actually gotten a lot closer over time.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you go a little further along, you get into radio and TV, and that's really small at first, but that really expands into, basically what we have today. Did you follow that all the way up and see the different changes when it came to those media?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think prior to World War I, you could say, although there was some attempt by the government to control the news media during various wars, even the Civil War, the methods were fairly primitive at that time, as was the media. And, they may have controlled, say, telegraph cables and things like that, but they were relatively unsophisticated in the use of censorship and propaganda. But with the coming of World War I, the British really taught the Americans quite a lot about how to censor the news and how to use propaganda to further their objectives. So World War I was a really kind of a breaking point and brought the media and the government into a kind of routine working relationship. Now, coming up to World War II, things actually began to become a lot more sophisticated. There were a lot more media channels to worry about, for one thing. There were radio broadcasting was common at that time. So, it took actually two large organizations during World War II, one to censor the news and the other to create and disseminate propaganda. So by World War II, it was quite a big operation, and it involved pretty much everyone in the news media to some extent working for the government to try to keep the news media under control and giving the kind of message that the government wanted people to receive. It didn't really end after World War II, though, because, of course, we entered the Cold War era, and the CIA was created in 1947 with the passage of the National Security Act, and the CIA pretty much took over the propaganda operations from the organizations that had run them during World War II. So the CIA then developed a broad network of relationships with all levels of media, from freelancers all the way up to chief executive officers of the major media corporations like CBS and the New York Times and so on. Now, a lot of this was brought out, it was publicized in the mid-1970s. There was something called the Church Committee, popularly known as the Church Committee, that began to examine the relationships between the CIA and the media. So it kind of became a big story there in about 1976. And, of course, everyone somewhat sort of, in the media sort of were rather embarrassed by all this, and they tried to pretend that they would stop doing this, but I don't think that's really happened. I think, the CIA didn't go away, and they're probably doing this as much now as they were then, probably a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to, for instance, one of the cases I think, the media was probably crazy at the time, was the whole situation with Roswell. It seemed like I talk about Roswell a lot. They come out with theirs, they capture a flying disc, and then the cover-up. But that was, I'm just wondering at the time why everybody just accepted it so quickly back then, that it was a weather balloon.
Right. Well, I think a lot of that had to do with the attitude that people had coming out of World War II. Americans were subjected to a very sophisticated propaganda campaign throughout World War II in order to keep people on the, sort of in a pro-war state of mind. And part of that was to try to impress upon people that they should always trust what the government says. The government the U.S. government are the good guys, and they don't lie or anything like that. So whatever they tell you, you should believe. And I think a lot of people actually embraced that attitude at the end of the war and on into the 1950s, that the U.S. government was credible and they wouldn't lie to the public. But of course, these days we're a good deal more sophisticated about that. We know that the government has lied to us about many things over the past few decades, the Gulf of Tonkin incident in World War or in Vietnam, and on and on. So there's a long history of this kind of deception. So people are much more skeptical today. But back in the 1940s, when the Roswell event occurred, I think people were much more willing to just accept whatever the government said.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mentioned earlier radio and television, but now we're into the computer age and the internet. There's online news. There's the Huffington Post that often writes about UFOs. And what has changed since the Internet's come along as far as what you see in the propaganda?
Well, I think the Internet has certainly provided a brand new array of media channels, and in that sense has made it much more difficult for the government to control information. So we have these alternative broadcasts such as yours, and you mentioned the Huffington Post and various other blogs and websites that do provide fairly good quality information. Sometimes, not always good quality, for sure, but at least the information is out there. You can do research, you can check facts yourself, and you have a greater variety of channels. Now, the whole idea of censorship and propaganda is that first you have to control what people know and what they believe, And once you have done that, you can tell them pretty much anything, and they'll accept it because they don't have any alternative points of view. So I think the UFO propaganda was fairly successful, up until maybe a decade or so ago, and that has sort of begun to break down a lot because of the variety of new media channels, cable, internet, and so on. So I think it's made it more difficult for the government to do this kind of thing.
And do you basically think it is the government still behind the propaganda?
Oh, yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I mean, the CIA has a huge budget, and a lot of their budget is devoted to propaganda. And historically, the CIA was involved in the UFO cover-up, from the very beginning, really. The Robertson panel, I think most people know about the Robertson panel. That was a panel that met in 1953 and basically said that the government should take measures to try to debunk or remove UFO coverage from the media as much as possible through the use of ridicule. And there's a lot of evidence that indeed was carried out. One of the more spectacular examples I cite in my book was that there was a memo discovered in the archives of the Smithsonian in which a member of the Robertson panel, Dr. Thornton Page, basically confessed that he had been involved in a CBS television documentary back in the 1960s, 1966, narrated by Walter Cronkite, and they were basically trying to get CBS to debunk UFOs and flying saucers using methods that the CIA had outlined back in 1953. So it shows that, some 13 years after the Robertson panel met, they were still doing this kind of thing. And I strongly suspect that not much has really changed.
Wow, that's amazing. Can you give some other examples of things that you found that were just, really solid, like more or less, let's call it evidence that this is happening?
Well, yeah, there's quite a few pretty good examples of this. I mentioned CBS. CBS was very anti-UFO, as was the New York Times. The New York Times they had a science writer named Walter Sullivan who was, made a great effort to ridicule and downplay flying saucer reports, even though the New York Times surely knew that they were being cited by airline pilots and other reliable people, but they never brought that out at all in the New York Times itself. So there was an effort, I think probably through pressure or through kind of the old boy network, to get the major networks to downplay the topic UFOs. And meanwhile, they began to play it up in the disreputable media, such as the National Enquirer. If you look at the National Enquirer historically, they have a very interesting history. The National Enquirer was started by someone named Gene Pope Jr., who has since passed away. But Gene Pope worked for the Central Intelligence Agency prior to starting the National Enquirer, and he worked in the psychological warfare department of the CIA, which is really propaganda. And he came out of the CIA with a lot of money in his pocket, and he bought a newspaper, which he later turned into the National Enquirer. Now, I think most people are aware that the Enquirer was probably the only national newspaper to consistently cover the UFO topic for quite a long time. And they generally did it by mixing it in with a lot of questionable material about celebrities and people like that. So the general impression that you got from reading the tabloids and looking at the tabloids was that UFOs were kind of a trashy, disreputable subject. And that, of course, is exactly what the Robertson panel said it wanted to do. So I think there's a pretty good trail of evidence there that the National Enquirer was covering the UFO topic because of Gene Pope's affiliation with the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, I can recall going through shopping, with my shopping cart and seeing the National Enquirer with, like Elvis's alien baby and, all these bizarre things. And to think that was possibly all propaganda for disinformation is fascinating that they'd go to that length.
Yeah, it is, and it's not the first time the CIA used this method, because according to an article I read about John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a fairly major economist, and he had been appointed ambassador to India under JFK, John F. Kennedy. And when he was in India, he came across a tabloid newspaper that was very much like the National Enquirer, only I think it had a political slant. And he did a little digging and found out that the people behind the publication was the Central Intelligence Agency. So this was a technique that the CIA used in various parts of the world to discredit certain political movements, probably left-wing political movements generally. And I think that they used this trick on the UFO topic as well to make the subject look silly, basically, so that people would be reluctant to talk about it and discuss it openly.
Are there certain networks that are more apt to show UFOs than others?
Well, I think they still tend to shy away from the subject as a serious news topic, although they will treat it in an entertainment context. I think that's what, the general statement I could make about that. They do realize that people are very interested in the UFO topic. According to a recent poll, or a poll a few years ago, something like 85% of the American public think the U.S. government is covering up knowledge of extraterrestrials. So it's an astonishing, majority that is quite certain these things exist and the government is covering them up. So they can't really get around that fact, and I think they use that, as to make money in an entertainment context. But they very, very rarely treat the subject in a serious news fashion. There are some exceptions on cable TV. The History Channel has done a number of reasonably good UFO documentaries, and a few other channels have done that as well. And I think, again, it comes down to the fact that there are more channels now for the propagandists to try to keep under control, and so it's a little more difficult than it was back in the 50s.
Mm-hmm. Larry King was an exception, I would say.
Yes, Larry King was. There have always been one or two programs. Of course, we're all familiar with Coast to Coast now, which is, they consistently cover the topic and do a pretty good job of it. There was a guy named Frank Edwards back in the 60s who was a radio announcer, and he did a program similar to the one started by Art Bell years ago. Mm-hmm. So there have always been one or two outlets that have kind of run against the tide, so to speak, and covered the subject. But generally speaking, if you look at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or publications like that, they generally don't take it seriously, and they don't hide the fact that they have utter contempt for the entire subject, and they go out of their way to ridicule it mostly.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were doing your research for your book, and up until present day, was there ever a time that someone let you know that you were kind of stepping on toes?
Not really, because the book, the way I published the book was I was using the relatively new technology called print on demand, and that was a new paradigm for publishing at the time. So I published it without going through the usual channels. However, after the book came out, I was visited by someone who, I don't want to give his name, but I know for a fact that he was a CIA contractor. And I had a chat with Linda Moulton Howe about this some years ago, and I was describing the whole situation, and she said, and he said, I just happened to be in the neighborhood, right? And those were exactly the words that this guy told me when he called me up. He said, I just happened to be in the neighborhood. So I think the CIA was definitely interested in me after the book came out. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. And just while you're talking about your book, you have that now on Kindle?
Yes, it's out on Kindle. It's an updated version of the original book, and so it's a separate listing, and it isn't listed on the print page. But if you do a search under Kindle for the missing times, it'll come up.
Now, when you say updated, can you tell us what you updated in the new version?
Well, there were a few minor mistakes that I made in the original version. I had confused two different radio stations in Minneapolis, KSTP and WCCO, and that was kind of an embarrassing mistake, which I wanted to fix. And I added some additional material. There was an article that came out in the New York Times fairly recently regarding the involvement of the wire services with the Central Intelligence Agency back during the Bay of Pigs period when the U.S. Attacked Cuba, basically. Mm-hmm. Basically it said that the CIA had the ability to put propaganda stories onto the AP and UPI wire services, among others. So I used that as further evidence to buttress my argument that the wire services are basically an extension of the intelligence agencies.
How can us as Americans protect ourselves from this? What can we do to stop the propaganda, to get the true stories out there? Any ideas on that?
Well, okay, first of all, you have to realize that the corporate media are controlled by about 6 different companies, and so there's a relatively small number of individuals and organizations that have control over most of the corporate news and information. So you can pretty much plan on the fact that you're getting propaganda through those organizations most of the time. So once you realize that, you have to realize that the alternative news organizations are much more likely to give you a straight explanation, and especially often the foreign news organizations, although not always, because many foreign organizations are also influenced by the CIA as well. So you always have to be a little skeptical about news and information generally. But I would look toward the smaller news organizations, the independent journalists and people like that. I think more and more there's a movement toward independent news and independent journalism generally, and I think that's probably the future for people who want to get reliable information.
Where do you get your news? Where would you suggest the listener to, as far as the topics of UFOs? Where's a good place to look?
Well, I get a lot of it through people I know quite often. They'll send me email bringing to my attention certain significant developments. So I kind of have my own network of sources. But I read all sorts of things. I'll do Google searches, using the term UFO, and I look at, pretty much everything. I look at a lot of different websites, a lot of, I listen to broadcasts. I listen to Coast to Coast. I've been on Coast to Coast. Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of different media out there. I'm kind of a media grazer, I guess you could say. I just, mm-hmm. read everything. I don't necessarily believe it, but I read a lot.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. You don't necessarily have to believe everything, that's for sure. Can you cite some of the cases that just come to mind right off the bat where you know that there was actually a cover-up? Okay, well,
I certainly think in the Roswell case there was definitely a cover-up. I mean, all the earmarks are there. There was a wire service reporter named Lydia Sleppy who started transmitting some of the Roswell information at the time, and I believe the FBI came on the line or called her up by telephone and said, do not transmit.
Oh, yes, right.
Stuff like that. So there clearly was some effort to suppress that story at the time. During you probably recall the Condon Commission, which was the University of Colorado investigation into UFOs in the 1960s.
Oh, yeah.
At the time, when that was all going on, it was quite a controversial event. And there was a reporter for, I think it was the Boulder Daily Camera. His name was Roger Harkins, and he suspected that the CIA was kind of, stage managing a lot of the media coverage about this. And so one day one of the wire services, I think it was the AP, called him up and requested a story about the Condon Commission. And he thought, well, this is a great chance to do a little test here to see whether the CIA is filtering these stories. And so he did an interview with one of the Lorenzens, and he basically implicated the CIA. He gave Harkins a multi-point rationale for why the CIA would have to be interested in the UFO topic. So he wrote up this story and filed it with the AP under the theory that if a CIA operative at the CIA or at the AP branch realized the significance of this, that they would squelch the story and it wouldn't be filed on the wire. And sure enough, that's what happened. He filed the story, even though they had requested it specifically, and they killed the story, evidently, because it never went out on the wire. And, a lot of times if you, the case that I look at in considerable detail in my book has to do with the UFO overflights around Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, which was a fairly big regional story back in the mid-'60s and again in the mid-'70s. And there was a lot of local press coverage about this at the time. It was very well known. But mysteriously, the stories just never seemed to get out of the Montana area. They just seemed to stop at that point, and they weren't picked up by the national news organizations. And this is something that happens over and over and over again whenever there's a major flap of UFO activity, such as in Mexico some years back. There was a lot of regional coverage, but no U.S. national coverage. So it's really hard to account for that unless you assume that somebody is kind of filtering the stories that get through.
Wow. Is there a case you can think of where things just kind of ran wild and they couldn't stop it?
Let me think about that. I think, maybe the more recent example would be the Phoenix Lights story. That was interesting in that it occurred some years before the story actually broke in the national media, which is kind of interesting. I mean, you often see that. It takes a year or two before the story reaches the big city newspapers, which is pretty strange. But, of course, it was a big story in Phoenix at the time, and eventually the story did come out, and although it was denied initially by the governor of Arizona, he eventually recanted his testimony and said, yeah, he saw it too. So in a way, they tried, I think there was an effort to try to keep that one under wraps, but ultimately it came out, and even the relatively high-ranking politicians admitted that the thing had occurred. So.
Right. And almost a similar situation is Rendlesham Forest, really.
Yes, sure. Yeah, you'll see this a lot. There was a statement supposedly made by Napoleon Bonaparte in France many years ago. He said that it's not always necessary to censor a story if you can just delay its arrival to the point where it's no longer considered news. So that's something that you often see with major UFO events. There's a lot of regional coverage, a lot of noise about it in a very small geographical area, but the wire services don't seem to pick up the story, and they don't make it into the major newspapers and magazines until often many years later, and by that time, it's just not considered news anymore.
I agree with you. I think we have a very ephemeral society. We get over things really quickly, like what seems like a big news story. We're on to something else right away. And it's just, it's not the way, things have definitely changed as far as all that goes. Are there any books that have come out that are similar to yours or touch on the same subject as yours does?
Yeah, well, I'd certainly like to mention Robert Hastings' book, UFOs and Nukes, because he has fleshed out the picture that I started examining in my book regarding the UFO overflights of Montana. He's come up with many, many more sources from the military that make it clear that this was a major, major event that was going on, and of course, it never made it into the national media at the time. There's another book that I think sheds a lot of light on this. It's called Strange Company by Keith Chester, and the subtitle is Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II. And Keith makes it very clear from his research that the UFO phenomenon did not start in 1947. It was going on throughout the war years, and there was a lot more happening than people were told about at the time. And the reason people didn't know about it is that we were at war, and under the War Powers Act, the media were completely controlled by the Pentagon. And so the only news that made it into newspapers was news that the Pentagon wanted people to know about. And they certainly didn't want the public to know about all these strange things that were happening in the skies over Europe and Asia. So Keith brings it, shines a good light on that aspect of the history of the UFO topic, and makes it clear that military censorship did keep it under wraps until fairly recently.
Yes, a lot of times you hear people say, "Oh, this has only been happening 60 years. How come?" And if you really, really look into it, there were some types of sightings going all the way back. You can find records.
Oh yeah, that's right. There's no doubt about that. I think in Strange Company, Keith Chester talks about H.P. Robertson's role. We talked earlier about the Robertson panel, but Robertson was a very important figure in all this, although not many people know much about him. But during the World War II era, he was the principal scientific intelligence liaison between the U.S. and British government. So he was kind of the guy who had his finger on the pulse regarding these UFO sightings. And probably, I suspect Robertson was interested in this topic even before World War II. I wouldn't be surprised if he had read the books by Charles Fort that appeared in the early 20th century and that talked about all these weird sightings. So he probably had a good historical perspective on this, and then he was, took an interest in it during the war years and then on into the early 50s.
Wow. So interesting. This has been a lot of fun, Terry. Thank you so much for filling us all in on this very interesting topic.
Okay, well, I'm glad to be on the program.
The Missing Times is the book, News Media Complicity and the UFO Cover-Up. That's it for today, episode 34 with Terry Hansen. Remember to stop by our website, podcastufo.com. You can also leave a comment under our podcasts. Our last podcast sure had a lot of comments under it. And you can follow us on Twitter or like us on Facebook. If you'd like to contact me, that's martin@podcastufo.com. Thanks for listening.
everybody here differently, and that's about as simple as you can put it, and nobody can tell anybody what to do or how to play this music, how you interpret it, the music and what you want to do. If a person chose to do it like this or like that, or the way he wants to do it, with his own standard, that's what he wants to do.